This video is for teachers who are looking for an overview of Day 1 of Unit 1 in the Passport to Social Studies curriculum, the focus question of which is what were important turning points in early history of the United States, with the objective of students being able to define the concept of a turning point in study of history and examine examples of turning points in the early history of the United States. Additionally, as this lesson includes modeling of the first step of the Turning Points tool, which is an integral component of this unit, I will also discuss some approaches you might take as you introduce it to the students. As you'll see in a few minutes, if you aren't already aware, determining if something is a turning point is a very involved process, and to accommodate this, each of the steps will be addressed in a standalone video, with the exception of steps 4 and 5, which will appear together in one. Before getting started, as might be the case with several lessons in this unit, the students may find the content distressing or upsetting. However, it is still important that we study these events and critically read the related sources. In this Note to Teacher slide, links are shared to resources from Facing History and Ourselves, Teaching Tolerance, as well as the National Museum of the American Indian that offer strategies and ideas on how to address this. One last thing to remember is that we still use our virtual classroom as a place for students to express their discomfort and feelings of anger or distress that may emerge from learning about these topics in history. The lesson starts by presenting the students with a very well-developed definition of what a turning point is, and instructs them to write it in their own words. Paraphrasing is one of those skills that some students may need support with, especially if this is one of the first classes of the school year. If you are doing this synchronously with your class, one approach you can take is to instruct the students to identify the most important concept from each of these 3 sentences, then use them to construct their definition. Another option that I've had success with and the students seem to get a kick out of is to tell the students that in 60 seconds the definition will disappear, and they should use the first 30 seconds to read it, then the remaining 30 seconds to annotate it with anything they think will help them remember it. Then, after you've done your countdown and the definition is removed, it's funny how their minds tend to gravitate towards the more vital components of the definition. One last thing I found that this does work best when it's pitched as a game, not a test of their memorization. Next, students are asked to apply their definition to the founding of Jamestown, which is presented as a turning point. To get enough information for this, the class will watch a brief clip from The Story of Us, as well as an excerpt from the 1619 project. As part of this model and introduction segment, checking their progress and providing support as needed before moving on is judicious. Depending on your class's dynamics and the needs of your students, you might opt to set them up in pairs or in breakout rooms where each student shares their context while their partner determines if it fits the definition that they themselves created. This could spark a meaningful conversation where both written components are assessed for inaccuracies or incompleteness, as well as allowing for student collaboration. The independent work begins with the students reading a piece by Dr. Uhuru Williams and asking them to consider why he denoted each of these 4 events as turning points. The students will actually use this as the starting point for the rest of their independent work right after you model the first step of the turning point tool, which we are going to get to right now. I'm now going to pull up what the Turning Points tool looks like when it's printed on paper. Later in this video, I will switch back to the slide deck for the version that was adapted to accommodate remote learning. But for convenience, let's use this one for our initial general overview. After directing students to read these introductory paragraphs, draw their attention back to these 3 terms: change, continuity, and historical significance, and then explain to them how a turning point is really just a change that was 2 things. First, it's historically significant, and second, it's greater than the continuity of previous patterns, trends, or events. I know that this definition might be a lot for some students, so it may help them to view this concept as more of a mathematical equation where you simply write turning point =, historically significant change greater than continuity of events. As the students work through this process, they will learn the nuance of this procedure, but for now, this simplistic formula is likely enough to get them started and allow them to anticipate what they will be doing. Just below this, we can see the 5 steps of the process, and today we are going to be looking at step 1, which requires the contextualization of the proposed turning point. Because this might be one of the first lessons of the course, it's imperative that you not only make clear and succinct connections to the work they did in the previous year in global, but also remind them of the skills that they already possess. Depending on your students' strengths and weaknesses, modeling and think alouds as you go through the contextualization in step 1 might also be really beneficial. I'm going to flip back to the virtual version that appears on this slide deck so we can take a closer look at step 1. Now, it is a tall order to have the students contextualize an event, especially so early on in the course, where they might not have a lot of prior knowledge handy, which is going to make your modeling that much more important. To make this as useful as possible, you might want to consider doing the following 3 things. First, continually root their work in these guiding questions. Doing so will give focus to their reading and annotations, which ultimately is going to streamline their work. Second, for this model, which is focusing on the displacement of indigenous people by European settlement as a turning point, they already accessed 3 sources in this lesson: Dr. Williams's essay, the excerpt from the 1619 project, and the video clip. However, you might find that additional outside resources are necessary, so you can use this opportunity to model for the students how to locate those supplemental, reliable sources. Whether they are accessed online or provided by you is up to your discretion. And lastly, encourage students by reminding them that this is perhaps the most tedious step of the entire process, but it really does set the stage for everything else. Yes, this one may be a little research heavy, but by fully establishing the historical context of the event in question, they set themselves up to make more meaningful discoveries and deeper insights in all the subsequent steps. When your modeling is complete and all 4 boxes have entries, like in the exemplar slide provided that you see in front of you, you may want to provide the students with space to process and reflect on what they just observed. Conducting a poll or survey could be a time-efficient way to get a pulse on the class as a whole, as well as identify those students who need additional support. If you want to promote student-to-student discussion, you could also instruct them to first independently write one thing they are certain about regarding this first step, as well as one question that they have. Then pair them up in breakout rooms where they can share their statement and question, and see if their partner is able to offer clarification. When the whole class reconvenes, ask students to share any unanswered questions with you and the whole class, and that you might be able to provide an answer to them. When they are ready to continue with their independent work, the students will select one of those other turning points mentioned by Dr. Williams that they worked with earlier in the lesson, which they will then apply step 1 to. As mentioned earlier, depending on their prior knowledge, they may need access to outside information, and as with the model, they can either conduct internet research on their own and access online libraries or databases, or you can provide them with the sources that you already have bundled together for each of the options. If you opt for this last one, you might consider providing them with sources they will see later in this curriculum, which actually might be useful for them when they come across them at a later date. The lesson ends with a wrap-up question as well as a check for understanding. Like it mentions in this guidance for instruction slide, if you haven't yet reviewed the last 4 steps of the Turning Points tool with them, you should before having them consider this question, because they might incorporate some of what they anticipate into their responses.